What is Fascism? By Ignazio Silone, from his book Fascism, published 1934. It can seldom have happened that the opinions of contemporaries about a historical occurrence have been so diverse and mutually inconsistent as has been true of opinions about fascism over the past 10 years or so, and that not only in respect of its political role, but its external characteristics as well. If we had only books, newspapers, and journals to instruct us, we would not know whether we were concerned with a movement of large capitalists or petty bourgeois, of soldiers or workers, a reactionary or revolutionary movement, a transient or a permanent one. And all this in spite of the fact that fascism is no secret society and does not inhabit the coast of Zanzibar. These false opinions about fascism that are current, these misleading characterizations and interpretations, are to be explained first of all by the rapid development of fascism and by the contradictions that fascism itself embodies. Even when these views are mistaken and inadequate, they at least contain an element of truth, insofar as they relate to a particular stage of fascist development, or to fascism in a particular region, or only to the social composition of the fascist organizations, to its methods of struggle, or its ideology, whereas a genuinely historical judgment on fascism should take account of all these elements in their totality, and in the contradictory rhythm of their mutual interconnectedness. A further explanation for the conceptual confusion that prevails on the subject of fascism is undoubtedly to be found in the fact that the political commentators in the final analysis treat fascism simply from the standpoint of their own party. And in those countries experiencing a deep crisis, the sphere of party organization has been taken over by the bureaucratic apparatus at the expense of the political one. Tactical problems have crowded out the discussion of party programs, and in their press and literature, the requirements of agitation, which seeks immediate results, have replaced the critical activity of analysis, which seeks nothing if not the truth. À la guerre comme à la guerre. Even Marxism has not always escaped this degeneration in its own critical analytical method. Agitation requires simplified concepts by its very nature, and such concepts become blunted very quickly. A political movement, which seeks to grapple seriously with reality, always therefore needs the check of a truly critical analysis. But thanks to this simplified way of thinking, fascism has now become what Caesarism became in Marx's time, a dark night in which all cats are grey. Just as Marx's contemporaries called every reactionary movement Caesarist, many of our contemporaries similarly treat fascism and reaction as mutually interchangeable concepts. Certainly, the meaning of words is always a convention, and just as we could agree to call all fruit trees cherry trees, we could as easily call all the political formations of past, present, and future by the name of fascism, absolutism and liberalism, parliamentarism and syndicalism, social democracy and communism. Yet even the laziest and least analytical of intellects will readily appreciate that a verbal confusion of this sort must lead directly to a confusion of understanding, or else that once the word fascism has been deprived of its particular significance, it has to be accompanied by a specifying adjective in order to designate and make intelligible any form of political power that is different from true fascism. The differentiation of language is thus merely the product of the differences between things. Of course, you can call the same thing by different names, that is the poet's style, but you cannot for long call two different things by the same name. Fascism is not the only form that reaction takes at the present time. The tendency to dismantle democratic institutions, to restrict popular control of government, and to make the preservation of the dominant class increasingly secure, this is the universal tendency in every capitalist country, including the expressly democratic ones. Underneath this general tendency, however, are to be found the most varied configurations of social forces, a fact that is fully explained by the Marxist theory of the uneven development of society. The forms which reaction assumes are never arbitrary. In the last analysis, they are always determined by the historical situation and by class relationships. We can divide the very different historical phenomena that are currently classified as fascist into three basic types. A. Military dictatorships. B. The reactionary consolidation of ancient state forms without the suppression of parliament or the abolition of the traditional party system. C. Fascist dictatorships. Military dictatorship should not be confused with fascism. Pronunciamentos and military dictatorships are to be found in all periods, even among pre-capitalist forms of government, whereas fascism is a phenomenon typical of our own time. Military dictatorships tend not to occur in an advanced capitalist country, in which there are strong political organizations and a numerous petty bourgeoisie, but rather in a backward country, in which the modern bourgeoisie is still weak, unorganized, and divided into numerous individualist circles, and where the feudal elements are still strong, and the army is the most powerful political organization. In general, a military dictatorship does not alter the social status quo, but performs a purely conservative function. It also shows itself incapable of establishing an organic equilibrium between the various branches of production, between industry and agriculture, between the feudal elements and the modern bourgeoisie, between foreign and domestic capital. In contrast, fascism is able to develop new forms of industrial and financial organization under the direction of large-scale capital, and thereby to push the concentration of capital to its very limits. In backward countries, the army forms the strongest line of defense against the so-called anarchy of the popular masses and the corruption of the ruling politicians. It can easily seize supreme power. The only difficulty that the authors of a pronunciamento have to fear is always the internal conflicts within the army, or more precisely within the officer corps. They have nothing to fear from the ruling political parties. A telephone call to the nearest barracks is sufficient to render them amenable. The route that fascism has to travel to win power is very much harder. Fascism arises from the dissolution of the established system of traditional parties, against which it is forced to wage a highly energetic political struggle. At the same time, it fights with the most modern weapons of civil war against the workers' organizations for months, often for years, before the issue is decided. This is not to deny that there is also a militarist element in fascism, but it is not its basic one. The entire institutions of the established constitutional state, the army, the police, judiciary, educational institutions, find themselves naturally driven to take part in the struggle for the fascist reorganization of the state. But the character of fascist reorganization is such that its basic features cannot be supplied by any of the institutions of the established constitutional state. Otherwise fascism would be superfluous, and superfluous also the subversion of the whole existing party system, and the civil war that is long, hard, bloody, and of uncertain outcome. Another consideration is that in the major economically advanced countries, where universal military service is the norm, it is not so easy to use the army for political purposes as it is in the more backward countries. There, too, political life is not the privilege of a few cliques of politicians, but is a matter of mass involvement, which immediately reflects itself in the army as well, in which not only the soldiers but often their officers belong to opposing political camps. This may also explain why, ever since the March on Rome, Mussolini has opposed too active an involvement of his officers in public life, and why he has prevented military demonstrations in support of fascism, repeating the old refrain about the army above parties. It is equally mistaken to confuse fascism with the reactionary consolidation of established institutions in the context of parliamentarism, and under the leadership of the traditional conservative parties. The reactionary consolidation of established state forms is a general tendency of all bourgeois states, even those that are in no immediate danger because of the weakness of their workers' movement. Even in such countries, which are still hardly affected by the economic, social, and political crisis, exceptional legislation has been passed against the workers' organizations, and antiquated laws that have fallen into disuse have been resurrected. Even here, the authorities have little hesitation in employing the most brutal measures to suppress the political and economic movement of the working class. They have little hesitation either in abandoning legality when it comes to depriving the workers of the weapon of street demonstrations, or blocking the expansion of the socialist or communist press, or when necessary disbanding the workers' parties altogether and driving them into illegality. These have become the established methods in all the capitalist countries, even those where the crisis is not yet dangerous. What we have here is certainly a tendency towards fascism, but not yet fascism itself. Fascism comes later. In Italy, Giolitti was responsible for an unprecedentedly ruthless suppression of the labour movement, without bothering himself in the slightest about legality. This was a preparation for fascism, but not yet fascism itself. In Poland, the representative of the large landowners, Witos, subjected the labour movement to a real reign of terror. For this reason, his government was considered a fascist dictatorship, and it was this mistaken assessment that enabled the real fascism to develop and come to power under the slogan "Down with Fascism." It was not until a few years later that people realized Witos had prepared the way to fascism, but that he was not himself fascist. The Poles had to pay a very heavy price for this mistaken analysis with the coup d'état of Pilsudski. A similar error can occur in any country where the crisis has not yet reached the favourable point for the development of fascism, where the old system of traditional parties still keeps the petty bourgeois masses in check, and the disruption of the workers does not yet threaten capitalist profit. Events sufficiently prove that fascism is not a specifically Italian phenomenon, but an international one. Once we have demolished the view of those who see fascism everywhere, we have to combat even more decisively the view of those who regard fascism as a privilege of certain inferior peoples. The first aspect of any attempt to define fascism is the chronological one, involving an answer to the question, when did fascism first appear? Fascism originated in a few capitalist countries with relatively weak economies, where a unified national state was still a recent creation, and lacked any rooted tradition among the masses. It originated immediately after the war, when the pressure from the proletarian movement was very strong. The whole social edifice was shaken to its foundations. The established system of historical parties was in disarray, and broad strata of the small and middle bourgeoisie were in a state of panic. German fascism proves, however, that economic advance is insufficient to render a country immune from the fascist threat. Without doubt, the uneven development of different countries tells against any simultaneous occurrence of political phenomena across the whole globe. This fact has always encouraged the fanatical exponents of national particularity to regard every new political phenomenon as uniquely determined by the circumstances of a single country. In Hungary, fascism occurred after the overthrow of the government of workers' councils. In Italy, Poland, and Finland, fascism developed after an unsuccessful onslaught by the revolutionary proletariat. In Germany and Austria, fascism came after an abortive revolution, and in the course of a crisis that convulsed all parties, including the workers' parties, to the core. From the chronological point of view, we arrive at the following two conclusions. 1. The only countries to escape a genuine fascist movement are those where capitalism is not yet seriously endangered. 2. The prospect of an extension and aggravation of the capitalist crisis, together with the disintegration of the traditional bourgeois parties and a prolongation sufficient to render the workers' parties impotent, contains all the ingredients for a further extension of fascism. The second aspect of the attempt to define fascism is the morphological one, in answer to the question, in what form did fascism emerge? In its first phase, fascism always presents itself as a patriotic movement. In Italy, the first fascist recruits came on the one hand from the middle strata, who saw themselves doomed to extinction by the capitalist crisis and rose against their traditional parties and institutions. On the other hand, from strata of the working class, who were disappointed in their revolutionary hopes and rose against the proletarian parties. This is a fact that can no longer be denied. The petty bourgeoisie is an integral component of all revolutions in the making, Marx wrote in the 18th Brumaire. Today we can add that it is also an integral component of all fascist movements. Yet one cannot explain this by reference to ideological factors, by the presence of some reactionary spirit inherent in the middle strata, a myth that has definitely had its day. An explanation has to be sought instead in the class position of the petty bourgeoisie. Quote, in the most advanced countries, Marx wrote to Anakov in respect of Proudhon, the situation of the petty bourgeois predisposes him towards both socialism and capitalism, i.e., he is dazzled by the expansion of power of the big bourgeoisie on the one side, yet he shares in the suffering of the people on the other. He is bourgeois and people simultaneously. At heart, he prides himself on being neutral, on having found the true balance, albeit without falling into mediocrity. This petty bourgeois is the glorification of antithesis, since antithesis is the basis of his existence. He himself is nothing other than the personification of social contradiction." Unquote. In every social crisis, the petty bourgeoisie is a potential supporter of both warring parties, reaction and revolution, without being conscious of the fact. When the two fundamental classes of society come into conflict, the petty bourgeois plunges into the fray as champion of the fatherland, of order, of civilization, of the general interest standing above all. For this reason, he is easy prey for big capital. Yet it would be mistaken to imagine that the petty bourgeoisie is historically condemned to a condition of permanent opposition to the working classes, and that it could never become an ally of the socialist movement. This mistake was made in Italy in 1919. Of all the mistakes committed then, it was the most fateful, and the one which helped fascism the most to its success. First, conclusion. The Fascist Party should not be confused with the traditional conservative parties, despite the fact that it arises from their dissolution. Its manner of emergence, its social foundations, its organization, methods, ideology and leadership all make of it a new and characteristically contemporary kind of party. Second conclusion. Fascism is not only and not primarily a movement of armed mercenaries. It is not only and not primarily a movement of white guardists. It is a broad political movement of the masses. At its inception, the majority of its supporters were unaware that it acted in the service of capitalism. The third aspect of the definition of fascism is the dialectical one. In answer to the question, how does fascism develop and change? The historical conclusion that is demonstrated from this standpoint by every fascist party is this. Nowadays, it is impossible to fight the revolutionary workers' movement without falling prey to high finance. All fascist movements that have achieved power have confirmed this law. There is not one fascist party so far that has been able to avoid this fate. The support of high finance for the fascist cause inevitably brings in its wake the support of the whole traditional superstructure of society, all the established political parties and institutions, from the general staff to the church, from the judiciary to the universities. First conclusion. The petty bourgeoisie can certainly provide the political leadership for any type of government, but it is unable as a class to shape any government decisively. Even fascism, the strongest movement that has ever emerged from the petty bourgeoisie, results in the open dictatorship of high finance, and in an unprecedented repression of the petty bourgeoisie as a class. Second conclusion. There are no other historical possibilities available to the petty bourgeoisie than either the support of fascism or the support of the socialist movement. The political immaturity of the labour movement has driven the petty bourgeoisie into the arms of capitalism in the post-war period and helped fascism to victory. Those readers who have succeeded along with us in grasping the significance of the historical possibility of fascism will have no difficulty in understanding on their own the necessity of its downfall and the manner in which this will take place. It may take years, it may even take decades, but the triumph of capital over labour cannot last forever. The future belongs to socialism. The future belongs to freedom. This excerpt taken from Marxists in the Face of Fascism, edited by David Beetham.